If you kneel with me, we'll have a silent prayer to begin. Amen. In the first presentation of yesterday, we discussed the importance of history and the reasons that we needed to look at the subject of gay marriage. Both of those thoughts became an important introduction. As to why we're going to look at gay marriage, but spend most of our time looking at history. We discussed the problem with Adventism, not just that they use wrong methodology, but also that they don't have a correct understanding of history to apply methodology to. Whether that's biblical, Millerite, or any time in between or after. And liberal Adventism without a refined methodology or history makes similar mistakes. It's a uniform problem. So that was my excuse for spending 90% of this camp meeting with history. Then when we come to the gospel, the applications should make complete sense, logical sense. So I hope no one is falling asleep or put off through the study of history. Because it's one of the two things that people lack that sends them down a wrong path. So with that introduction, we move to our reform line. We discussed the history that led us to 1989. And explained how while people who are homosexual and lesbian had been persecuted before, and fought for their rights before, it wasn't until 1989 that the fight really began for gay marriage. And that can be seen inside and outside the United States. Outside with Denmark, it's the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. Sorry, registered partnerships, not same-sex marriage. It gave some protections, but it was not comprehensive. Then within the United States, there was a few key events. One in New York City, one in California. And an article by Andrew Sullivan in the New Republic titled A Conservative Case for Gay Marriage. Then we moved to Germany and saw that as the Berlin Wall was falling a short walk away, the first gay-themed film of East Germany was having its double premiere. Titled Coming Out. That is recognised as a turning point, even separately to the significance of the date. So it became a mainstream subject in 1989. In 1993, couples in Hawaii applied for marriage licenses. As they expected, they were denied, so they sued. They began that legal process in 1991. They fought with the state of Hawaii up until the state Supreme Court in 1993. And the Supreme Court said, the state of Hawaii is not making a good enough argument as to why they will not allow these couples to marry. And all the other states flew into a panic. And by 1996, they've put together, formalised the Act of DOMA. The Defence of Marriage Act. And it's really to try and isolate any state that pursues legalising gay marriage. So if a heterosexual couple get married in Georgia, it's recognised by the federal government and by all the other states. Now, Arkansas can't stop what Georgia does. but they can isolate it. So Act 2, Statement 2 of DOMA says, if a state allows gay marriage, none of the other states acknowledge that marriage. And Part 3 says the federal government does not acknowledge that marriage. So while they cannot control another state, they can isolate what that state does. We discussed 1996 as an election year. Which means that Bill Clinton he needed to get that Republican vote. He'd already tried to allow lesbian and homosexual members into the armed forces. And when he did that, he was surprised by the hostility that came. And he was afraid that if he didn't support the Republican Party with DOMA, it would negatively impact his chances of winning that 96 election. So we didn't want to go off track, but we also talked about what he did with immigration in 1996. That's about where we ended. We discussed this as the response to a group threat. We'll move on to 2001. So 1989 was the first country in the world to legalize registered partnerships. Or civil partnerships. 2001 was the first country in the world to legalize gay marriage. This was Denmark, this is the Netherlands. Netherlands became the first country in the world to legalize gay marriage. Even before it got to the Netherlands, the first gay marriages of modern times occurred in Canada on the 14th of January. It just took 2 years for that to be held up in court. So they became in 2003, they had been the first legal same-sex marriages. But it was the Netherlands that legalized it in 2001. And while some countries legalizing gay marriage. Arkansas finally decided to decriminalize homosexuality itself. So up until 2001, it was illegal to be a homosexual in Arkansas. So it's progress. I mention Arkansas because it continually comes up in prophecy. I'll remind you that A.T. Jones said the Sunday law would start in the state of Arkansas. So 1989, first country with registered or civil partnerships. 2001, first country with gay marriage. 2004, which I would remind you is a waymark. Just not one of our primary ones. Massachusetts became the first US state and the 6th jurisdiction in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. So this is the first US state to legalize same-sex marriage. Other cities in other states started to hand out marriage licenses. Especially in California. But the state hadn't legalized it. So without going into the messy legalities, it was just war. States knew they couldn't control what another state did. But now DOMA wasn't enough. Now they were afraid of it spreading to their state. Because finally, one of 50 states had taken the step. So by late 2004, 11 states amended their constitutions. Defining marriage as the union between one man and one woman. Arkansas was one of those. 2 more states did it in 2005. 8 more in 2006. So now they're not just happy with DOMA, now all the states are changing their constitutions. Because that was one of the problems with Hawaii. The Supreme Court of Hawaii said your constitution isn't clear enough on this issue. So the other states not only enacted DOMA, they also, from 2004, went in and started changing their constitutions. we come to 2009. Now, before we go to 2009, I want to touch on 2012. And then we'll come back to 2009 and tell just one story. But 2012 there was a singular event. Now, this is in the document of quotes, so I hope people can find that under 2009. "2012 was an election year, which means the Republican National Convention met and the Democratic National Convention met. And in 2012, for the first time, both political parties stated their position clearly. You'll remember back here, the Republican Party had stated their position, but the Democrat Party said nothing. The Republican National Convention approved a platform that asserts the right of the federal government and each state to deny legal recognition to same-sex marriages, and endorsed a constitutional amendment defining marriage as the union of one man and one woman. The Democratic National Convention adopted a political platform that supported marriage equality for the first time in its history and opposed all constitutional amendments that would exclude same-sex couples from marriage. It shouldn't surprise us that this is two opposing views of the Constitution. A war over the Constitution. The Republican Party is saying DOMA is not enough. The changes to the state constitutions are not enough. We need to make the Constitution of the United States Christian and ban same-sex marriage in the Constitution. The Democrat Party says, for the first time in their history, that they supported same-sex marriage and would fight any Republican attempt to change the Constitution. So both armies stake their ground. I think that's a type of formalization. But I want to come back to 2009 and Trace's story. Before we get to the story, September 15 of 2009, 3 Democratic members of Congress introduced legislation. And what they were fighting to do was to abolish DOMA. And they would establish it by introducing a new act. Democrat and Republican parties state their position. In 2009, the Democrat Party starts to fight DOMA. They've put together legislation called the Respect for Marriage Act. And this is an attempt to repeal DOMA. By replacing it with, instead of a defense of marriage, a respect for marriage. It had 91 original co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. And among them was quite a number of legislators who had voted for DOMA at the time. Including Bill Clinton. So he's fighting now to take down his own act. The Respect for Marriage Act was never passed. We will explain why. Because something else happened in 2009. I want to introduce you to a couple called Edie Windsor and Thea Spire. These were two lesbian women living in New York City. They'd lived as a couple in New York City by this time for 44 years. They had been engaged for 40 of those years. Almost half a century. And then in Canada, in May of 2007, they had been married. And after a 44-year relationship, in 2009, Thea passed away. Back to the document. This is from the American Civil Liberties Union website. Ordinarily, the second paragraph into that, I've paraphrased the first. That's just for the translators. Ordinarily, whether a couple is married for federal purposes depends on whether they are considered married in their state. New York recognized Edie and Thea's marriage, but because of a federal law called the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, the federal government refuses to treat married same-sex couples like Edie and Thea the same way as other married couples. When Thea died, the federal government refused to recognize their marriage and taxed Edie's inheritance from Thea as though they were strangers. So the state of New York recognized their marriage, But because of DOMA Act 3, Section 3, the federal government did not. And the taxing of the states comes through the federal government. So after a 44-year relationship and a 40-year engagement, Thea Spire left her inheritance to her wife Edie. But the federal government said, "You're not married." So as though they were strangers, Edie was supposed to pay taxes on that inheritance. And it was a significant inheritance. So in 2009, Thea Spire died. In 2012, Edie Windsor took the federal government to court. It had been to court, now she takes it to the Supreme Court. And this became Windsor versus USA. The Supreme Court accepts the case in 2012. But it's in 2013 that they decide on the case. Quoting from the document. DOMA, the 1996 Defence of Marriage Act, bars the federal government from recognising or providing federal benefits for same-sex couples married in states where such unions are legal. There are more than 1,000 such federal benefits and preferences. The case before the court was illustrative. Edith Windsor and Thea Spire, whose 2007 marriage was recognised by the state of New York, were together for 44 years. But when Spire died, Windsor was required to pay $363,000 US in federal estate taxes that she would not have owed if her spouse had been of the opposite sex. If Thea was a Theo, I would not have had to pay that, Windsor told NPR in March. Now that's just a terrible injustice. I think it's a mistake that has to get corrected. In 2012, it was taken up by the Supreme Court and they passed down their ruling in June of 2013. A 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court ruled that Section 3 of DOMA was unconstitutional. From 2013, the federal government has been forced to recognise same-sex marriage in the states in which it was legal. Section 3 of DOMA was unenforceable any longer. But you'll notice this is a 5-4 decision. RBG was known for her dissents. You should read the venom in the Conservative dissent. The Liberal members and RBG essentially dragged Scalia kicking and screaming. So this was not a happy Conservative faction. (2014). I'm going to read an article from the Boston Globe. It's written at the very end of 2014, December 23 of 2014. And it's titled, "2014 was a pivotal year for same-sex marriage." So we focus on 2015. I think we forget about 2013. And maybe we're not aware of the significance of 2014. A year ago, only about 1/3 of Americans lived in states that permitted same-sex marriage. Today, nearly 65% of Americans do, making 2014 perhaps the biggest turning point in the history of same-sex marriage in the United States. The change wasn't driven by a bevy of new laws or a big Supreme Court decision. Instead, it was a slow-burning sequence of consistent lower court rulings combined with the Supreme Court's decision not to intervene. Massachusetts was the first state to allow same-sex marriage. In the 10 years since, same-sex marriage has spread to 34 other states, including 18 new states just this year. States that continue to ban the practice tend to be concentrated in the South and the Midwest. So at the end of 2013, only about 33% of Americans lived in a state that legalized same-sex marriage. By the end of 2014, that was about 65%. It almost doubled. From 2004 to the end of 2013, 17 states had legalized same-sex marriage. In 2014, 1 year alone, 18 states legalized same-sex marriage. And this was not a Supreme Court case, this was all the lower courts. Continuing to read, what drove this year's expansion of same-sex marriage? In a streak of victories in federal courts, and especially in the appellate courts that make law for whole regions of the country, various statewide bans on same-sex marriage were declared unconstitutional. At first, many of those rulings were put on hold, which is not uncommon. Sometimes lower courts want to hit the pause button and let the Supreme Court weigh in before implementing big social changes. But in October, the Supreme Court decided not to intervene. They didn't say why, but it may be because there was no dispute for them to resolve. The pro-marriage side had won every case. So all the lower courts were declaring these bans unconstitutional. But instead of enacting their decision, they'll say, we'll just put this decision on hold until the Supreme Court gives it its opinion. Because I'm just a lower court and this is a massive social change. So we need to know what the Supreme Court thinks. The Supreme Court looks over at the lower courts, and every single lower court had come to the same conclusion. That same-sex marriage bans were unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court says, if there's no disagreement, why do I need to intervene? Do what you want. You're not fighting. You all agree with each other. So when the Supreme Court refuses to intervene, all of those decisions go into force. But then after they've already done that, right towards the end of 2014, shortly after the Supreme Court decided not to review those earlier cases, a disagreement finally occurred. The Sixth Circuit, which covers Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, became the first appeals court to uphold a state ban on same-sex marriage. The article then explains how the Supreme Court may now want to intervene because now there's an argument. The lower courts are coming to different conclusions. And now those supporting same-sex marriage are pushing the Supreme Court to intervene. Particularly because they know 2013 was decided by a 5-4 Liberal majority. I shouldn't call all 5 of them true Liberals. And they know that just one change in the Supreme Court and they could lose this window of opportunity. So by the end of 2014, everyone's on the edge of their seats waiting to see what the Supreme Court is going to do. As pivotal as 2014 has been in the history of gay marriage, 2015 may be definitive. If the Supreme Court rules in favour of gay marriage, the United States would join the growing ranks of countries that have embraced it. Alternatively, a Supreme Court ruling against gay marriage would force the issue back to the states, potentially leading to a dramatic retrenchment in the number of same-sex couples who are able to marry. So there's a number of things all happening at once. You've had Edie Windsor take the United States to the Supreme Court and win in 2013. You've had a few years of the Democrat Party trying to repeal DOMA. With another Alternative Marriage Act. You have Part 3 of DOMA already repealed, essentially. All the lower courts are repealing same-sex marriage laws in their states. And this takes us to 2015. And another couple. 2013 was Edie Windsor and Thea Spire. When Windsor won that court case, there was a homosexual couple who leant over and said, "Let's get married." But same-sex marriage was not legal in the state that they belonged to. This couple was John Arthur and Jim Obergefell. In people wanting to say Oberfell, I did look up how to pronounce it. It's Obergefell. So John Arthur and Obergefell met in the early 1990s. It was, they often joked, love at third sight. First time they met, not interested. Second time, not interested. Third time they met, they were inseparable. So by this time period, they'd been together for about 20 years. But there was one problem in 2013. When, I believe it was Jim Obergefell, leant over and said, let's get married. John Arthur was dying. There was no way they would be able to drive him in a car to another state where gay marriage was legal. Because it wasn't in their state. There's no way they would be able to put him on a regular flight either. He was not a well man. So family and friends came together. And they raised money to pay for a medical flight. I think it was about $13,000 to get a medical flight to another state. They flew to the tarmac of Baltimore Washington International Marshall Airport. I can't share screen, can I? Okay. I'll just, it's okay if I can't, I just don't see it. They married in the plane and then flew back. Continuing to read, all the translators at the same place starts, there was no honeymoon. There was no honeymoon, of course, and a few days after they wed, an old neighbour mentioned their situation to Al Gerhardstein, a local civil rights attorney. I knew right away they had a problem, Gerhardstein said, and I knew they probably weren't thinking about it. Who thinks about a death certificate after getting married? You see how many of these changes are really thought over when one partner is going to lose another. or has lost another. So the problem was in their state, same-sex marriage was not legal. So they might have got married in a plane on a tarmac in another state. But when they flew back to their own, and a few months later, John Arthur passed away, what name goes on the death certificate? Because John Arthur had wanted to take Jim Obergefell's name. And a neighbour contacts a civil rights attorney. And the attorney says, now there's a problem. So they went to court. They won the first ruling. So their state of Ohio appealed to a higher court. And he lost in the higher court. So Obergefell says, that's fine, I'm going to the Supreme Court. Now, it was not the only case that it was not just him versus the Supreme Court. There were many cases similar to his that the Supreme Court was considering. They're all lumped together in one. And they didn't name this court case after him because they just liked him. It's a complicated process how that name gets to be chosen. He didn't even want it chosen. It's not a choice. But because of how they must be decided, it became Obergefell versus Hodges. Really, it's Obergefell versus the state of Ohio. But Hodges was the representative of the state. Forget his title. So he took it to the Supreme Court, finishing that article by the Washington Post. He keeps reminding himself about what his fight is really about, the death certificate, the title of spouse, even as he feels the growing pressure of a monumental civil rights moment. It's hard to put into words, Obergefell said, how to grasp that our decision to stand up and say this isn't right is going to affect so many people. We know what that 2015 court decision was. This was June 2013, this was June 2015. On the 26th of June 2015, the US Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell versus Hodges that the 14th Amendment requires all US state laws to recognize same-sex marriages. This left Section 2 of DOMA as superseded and unenforceable. The Respect for Marriage Act was never passed because in the end it never needed to be. Because one lesbian couple, Edie Windsor and Thea Spire, the surviving spouse took down Section 3 of DOMA. And in 2015, one homosexual couple, Jim Obergefell and John Arthur, took down Section 2 of DOMA. And while it might exist on the books, it's now superseded and unenforceable. In 2013 and 2015, a lesbian couple, a homosexual couple, both in committed relationships, one for about 20, one for about 44, both committed. John Arthur asked Jim Obergefell to remarry after he died. He still says he can't do it. These two couples from in 13 and 15 took down Section 2 and Section 3. As we said, Section 1 has no meaning. And from 2015, gay marriage became legal in the United States. For every single state. The Supreme Court stepped in and decided. I've intentionally not gone farther. I want to end this discussion of our reform line at 2015. Except to say this one thing. Do we think the Conservatives were happy? You know what they thought in 2013, they were quite expressive. But in 2014, as all of this is happening beneath their feet, and Steve Bannon and other Republicans are stoking flames about a culture war, they can see it's a war they're losing. So by the time you get into 2015, 2016, what do you expect except a Donald Trump? Why do you think they don't care in whatever form their saviour comes? Because they have had defeat after defeat after defeat. When we see Trump's introduction in 2015, and then we trace 2016 to the January 6th insurrection, and what is happening right now? This is just internal civil war. Remember revolutions? And one side afraid of losing. So what do you have to do? Mobilize against a group threat. Remember when it came to Millerite history? Why did it lead to a civil war? Because despite the fact that the good parties were full of compromises, slave states and slaveholders began to feel more and more isolated. And few people, even in the North, recognized the depth of feeling. Everything we've seen from 2015-16 to now has just been a response to this fight. I thought one article made a really good point. Why are so many conservatives in the United States not getting vaccinated? Why won't Fox News and the Republican Party just tell people to go get vaccinated? It's not just conspiracy theories. There's something much deeper. This is why logic itself isn't going to make a difference. Even if they were forced to see those vaccines as positive, as life-saving, do you ever have an argument with someone and they can see that you're right and they're wrong? But rather than admit it, they just get so irritated. They keep moving the argument. It becomes childish. It becomes really self-harm. If I can't win on this point, I'm going to dig my heels in at every single other point. Conservatives' hesitancy to take vaccines is as much connected to this as it is to conspiracy theories. Because when you're losing a war, and it hurts, when you're losing an argument, you dig your heels into the ground like a child in a supermarket. Can't get what you want. Just lay on their back and say, well, I'm not going anywhere. Even if it's good for me. This is the resistance and the difficulty with working with the Republican Party now. They are not dumb people. They are not incapable of logic. But they are going to make every democratic advancement as difficult as possible. Because we don't realize how much they were hurt when they kept losing. I'll review before we close. Actually, we'll close now. I'll come back and review. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for how we can trace history. Thank you how you lay it out for us. Breaking it down, making it simple. Maybe we be willing to sit at your feet and learn. May we treasure these things. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.